A white police officer spots a young black man stepping out of a luxury car in a suburban plaza and instantly assumes the worst. Officer Mark Taylor's mind races. Is this man a thief? Is that car stolen? Without any proof, he springs into action, determined to stop what he believes is a crime in progress. But what happens next will leave him, and everyone watching, completely stunned. Officer Taylor thought he was upholding the law, but instead, he uncovered something that forced him to question his own beliefs. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales that challenge and inspire. It was a bright afternoon at a busy suburban shopping plaza. The parking lot buzzed with activity as shoppers moved in and out of stores, carrying bags filled with groceries, clothes, and gadgets. Among them was Jordan Mitchell, a young black man in his early 30s. He stepped out of his sleek, black luxury car, dressed casually in jeans and a button-up shirt, his easy smile reflecting his laid-back demeanor. Jordan was a self-made entrepreneur, the CEO of a tech company he'd built from scratch. To him, this was just a quick stop to pick up some items before heading to his next meeting. On the other side of the parking lot sat Officer Mark Taylor in his patrol car. Mark, a middle-aged white officer with years of experience, prided himself on his ability to read people. He believed his instincts were what made him good at his job, but those instincts were often clouded by deeply ingrained stereotypes. He scanned the lot, his eyes locking onto Jordan as he parked and stepped out of his car. Mark's gaze narrowed. The expensive car, the shopping bag Jordan was carrying, none of it seemed to fit the narrative Mark had already created in his mind. How does someone like him afford a car like that? Mark thought to himself, his jaw tightening. His bias kicked in almost instantly, and in his mind he was already convinced. This guy's up to something. Jordan walked toward his car, his shopping bag in hand, ready to load it into the trunk. He wasn't in a rush, moving with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. But to Mark, that confidence looked like arrogance, and he saw it as a challenge. Mark stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Hey, you!" he called out, his voice firm. Jordan stopped and turned, surprised to see the officer walking toward him. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jordan asked politely, his tone calm. Mark didn't answer the question directly. "Where'd you get that car?" he asked instead, his eyes narrowing. Jordan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It's my car," he said, his voice still calm. "Why?" Mark wasn't convinced. "Your car, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Mind telling me what's in the bag?" Jordan tilted his head slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "It's just some things I picked up from the store," he replied, lifting the bag slightly to show the logo of the high-end boutique he had just visited. "Is there a reason you're asking?" Mark's hand rested on his belt near his holster. "There is," he said sharply. "We've had reports of thefts in the area. You match the description." Jordan raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor starting to crack. "Really?" he asked, his tone now carrying a hint of disbelief. "Do I match the description?" "What description is that exactly?" Mark ignored the question, his tone growing more aggressive. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, his posture stiffening as a few passers-by started to take notice of the scene. Jordan sighed, setting the shopping bag down and reaching for his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his ID. "But I'm telling you, there's no reason to suspect me of anything." Mark studied the ID, but the name didn't register. To him, it was just another face, another name, nothing that explained how Jordan could afford such an expensive car. His suspicions grew. "How'd you pay for this car?" he asked, his voice now louder. Jordan's frustration was evident. though he kept his tone measured. "I bought it, legally, with my money," he replied. "Why is that so hard to believe?" By now, a small crowd had begun to form, murmurs rippling through the group. Some took out their phones to record, sensing that the situation might escalate. Jordan stood his ground, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Mark, however, seemed unfazed by the crowd, his focus locked entirely on Jordan. "You expect me to believe that?" Mark asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Prove it. Show me the registration." Jordan crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "You're seriously asking me to prove that I own my own car?" he asked. "All because you think I stole it? What exactly is your reason, officer?" Mark ignored the question, convinced he was in the right. To him, this was just another day of enforcing the law. But to Jordan, it was something far more personal, a painful reminder of the assumptions people made about him because of the color of his skin. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. Officer Mark Taylor stood in front of Jordan Mitchell, his posture rigid and his tone sharp. "Show me the registration," he repeated, the tension in his voice evident. The parking lot was now filled with the murmurs of onlookers, some pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Jordan looked around, noticing the growing crowd, and let out a small sigh. "I don't have the registration on me," Jordan said evenly, his patience wearing thin. "It's in the glove compartment. But I still don't understand why you're assuming this car isn't mine." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "People like you don't just drive cars like this," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Jordan to hear. The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. A few gasps rippled through the crowd, and someone shouted, "That's out of line!" Jordan's jaw tightened. His calm demeanor began to shift, replaced with a firm resolve. "What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" he asked, his voice now louder and more forceful. "People like me? What kind of people are you talking about?" Mark avoided the question, instead stepping closer to Jordan. "I'm doing my job," he said, his voice growing defensive. "You're acting suspicious. First, you don't park in a spot, then you get out of this fancy car, and now you don't have proof that it's yours. It doesn't look good." Jordan took a deep breath, trying to control his rising frustration. "What doesn't look good is you harassing me for no reason," he said. "I've been respectful. I've shown you my ID. What more do you need?" Mark reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against it as he prepared to call for backup. "You're escalating this situation," he said coldly. "If you cooperate, this will go smoothly." "I'm not escalating anything," Jordan shot back. "You approached me. You accused me. You're the one making this something it doesn't need to be." The crowd grew louder, their murmurs turning into open comments. "He's not doing anything wrong," one woman shouted. Another man chimed in, "Why don't you just listen to him?" Mark's face flushed, his irritation mounting as he realized the growing public scrutiny. Ignoring the crowd, Mark pointed to the car. "Open the glove compartment. Let me see the registration." Jordan hesitated for a moment before walking to his car. He opened the door, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out a folder containing the vehicle's registration and insurance. He handed it to Mark, who snatched it from his hands and began scrutinizing the documents. The registration clearly displayed Jordan's name, but Mark wasn't ready to back down. "These could be fake," he muttered, his tone defiant. Jordan's shoulders tensed and his frustration bubbled over. "This is ridiculous," Jordan said, his voice rising. "You're determined to find something wrong, even when the proof is right in front of you. What more do I have to do to convince you that I'm not a thief?" Mark was about to respond when someone from the crowd stepped forward, a man in his 40s holding a phone. "Officer, what you're doing is unacceptable," the man said. "This is racial profiling, plain and simple." Mark's head whipped toward the man. "Stay out of this," he barked. "This is a police matter." The crowd erupted into a mix of protests and shouts, their frustration mirroring Jordan's. Despite the noise, Jordan kept his focus on Mark. "You're digging yourself into a hole, officer," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You're so blinded by your assumptions that you're ignoring the truth." Mark clenched his jaw, his pride preventing him from admitting he might have been wrong. He glanced at the registration again, his mind racing. Something about the name on the document nagged at him, but he couldn't place it. Finally, he turned back to Jordan, still unwilling to concede. "You said your name is Jordan Mitchell?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "That's right," Jordan replied. "What about it?" Mark furrowed his brow, pulling out his phone and quickly searching for something. His heart sank as the search results appeared. The name, Jordan Mitchell, was attached to several articles and profiles, all highlighting the achievements of a young, successful black entrepreneur who had founded a multi-million-dollar tech company. The realization hit Mark like a ton of bricks. He glanced at Jordan, then back at the crowd, many of whom were now staring at him with visible anger and disappointment. His face flushed, and his grip on the registration tightened. He had made a terrible mistake. Jordan crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Do you get it now?" he asked. "Do you finally understand who you're dealing with?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was undeniable, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The crowd watched, waiting for what would happen next. As the tension reached its peak, Mark realized he had no choice but to confront the consequences of his bias. And for Jordan, the moment of truth had arrived. Officer Mark Taylor stood frozen, his grip tightening on the registration papers as he stared at his phone screen. There it was, clear as day, Jordan Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Tech Innovations, a multi-million-dollar tech company. Photos of Jordan smiling confidently at business conferences and charity events filled the search results. Mark felt the heat rise in his face as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the man standing before him. The crowd sensed the shift. Whispers turned into murmurs, and some people openly began to call Mark out. "You see it now, don't you?" one man shouted. "You just embarrassed yourself." Jordan remained calm but firm, his arms crossed as he watched Mark wrestle with the truth. "So, officer," Jordan said, breaking the silence, "are you ready to explain why you've been harassing me for driving my own car?" Mark stammered, his usual confidence replaced with a mix of shame and defensiveness. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "There were reports of theft in the area, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Jordan interrupted, his tone cutting through the air. "You thought that because I'm black and driving a nice car, I must have stolen it? Let's be honest, officer. This wasn't about theft reports. This was about your bias." Mark tried to respond, but Jordan wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be judged every day because of the color of your skin?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly prove that you belong to people like you who assume we're criminals before we even open our mouths?" The crowd erupted into applause, cheering Jordan on. Mark's face turned a deep shade of red as he looked around, realizing there was no way out of this. His pride clashed with his guilt, and for a moment he stood there, paralyzed. "I made a mistake," Mark finally said, his voice barely audible. "I thought—" "No," Jordan said firmly, cutting him off. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You didn't stop to question your assumptions. You just acted, and in doing so, you disrespected me, humiliated yourself, and undermined the very profession you claim to uphold. Mark's shoulders slumped as Jordan's words hit him like a hammer. The crowd's energy shifted slightly, their voices softening as they watched the officer grapple with the weight of his actions. Jordan took a step closer, his voice steady but full of conviction. "This isn't just about you and me," he said. "This is about a system that allows people like you to act on your biases without consequences. It's about the countless others who don't have the resources or the platform I do to fight back. I could have been another statistic today, another innocent black man harassed, or worse, because someone like you made the wrong assumption." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but deep down, he knew there was no excuse. Jordan was right. The tension in the air was palpable as Jordan took a deep breath, his tone softening slightly. "You've been given power, officer," he said. "Power to protect and serve, not to profile and intimidate. It's time you started using that power responsibly." Mark nodded faintly, his head hanging low. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I was wrong." "Apologies are a start," Jordan replied, "but they're not enough. Change starts with accountability, and it's up to you to decide what kind of officer and what kind of person you want to be." Jordan's words seemed to break through Mark's defenses. For the first time, he looked Jordan in the eye, his expression a mix of regret and vulnerability. "You're right," he said quietly. "I need to do better." The crowd began to applaud again, this time with a sense of hope. Some murmured words of encouragement, while others continued to record the moment on their phones. Jordan turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every single person who's ever been judged unfairly because of their skin color, their background, or their circumstances. It's about making sure moments like this become the exception, not the norm." The crowd cheered, their voices filled with admiration and support. Mark stood off to the side, listening intently, his heart heavy with the weight of his mistakes. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he also knew this moment had changed him. Jordan turned back to Mark, extending a hand. "I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to grow," he said. "It's not too late to be the kind of officer people can trust." Mark hesitated for a moment before shaking Jordan's hand. The gesture was small but significant, a step toward reconciliation and accountability. As the crowd began to disperse, many approached Jordan to thank him for standing up and speaking out. Some even patted Mark on the shoulder, offering quiet words of encouragement. As the parking lot cleared, Mark stood alone for a moment, staring at the registration papers in his hand. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules and kept people safe. But today had shown him that being a good cop wasn't just about following the law. It was about treating people with dignity and respect, regardless of his own assumptions. Jordan walked to his car, his head held high. He knew this moment would stay with him, not just as a personal victory, but as a step toward greater change. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Mark still standing there, deep in thought. The confrontation was over, but the lessons it carried would echo far beyond that parking lot. For both men, this was the beginning of a journey, one toward understanding, accountability, and a future where respect and justice could truly prevail. As Jordan drove away, Officer Mark Taylor remained standing in the parking lot, his mind racing with everything that had just transpired. The truth he had uncovered about Jordan's identity had been like a mirror, forcing him to confront his own biases and how they shaped his actions. But it wasn't over yet. Mark's sense of duty and personal pride compelled him to try and make things right. Hours later, Mark sat in his small, dimly lit office at the precinct. He stared at his computer screen, reading article after article about Jordan Mitchell. The man was a tech innovator, a self-made millionaire, and a philanthropist who had poured resources into education programs for underprivileged communities. Jordan's success wasn't just financial, it was personal. He had overcome countless challenges to achieve what many thought was impossible. One article in particular stood out. In it, Jordan recounted his experiences growing up in a predominantly low-income neighborhood, where he constantly faced discrimination. The article highlighted an incident from Jordan's youth, where he was stopped and searched by police officers for fitting the description of a suspect. That day had left a lasting impact on him, shaping his resolve to rise above the stereotypes and give back to his community. Mark leaned back in his chair, the weight of guilt settling in. He's been through this before, Mark thought, and today I just made it worse. The following morning, Mark found himself parked outside the community center where Jordan was scheduled to speak at a mentorship event. He had hesitated about coming. He wasn't sure if he'd be welcome, but he knew he needed to take responsibility. Gathering his courage, he stepped out of his car and approached the entrance. Inside, the room buzzed with energy. Dozens of young people sat attentively as Jordan spoke on stage. His words were powerful, yet relatable, filled with encouragement for those who faced obstacles similar to his own. "Success doesn't mean you won't face challenges," Jordan said, his voice steady but warm. "It means rising above them and using those experiences to build something greater, not just for yourself, but for others." The audience applauded, clearly moved by his words. Mark stood at the back of the room, his uniform making him stand out. A few attendees glanced at him, their expressions wary, but no one said anything. Mark kept his gaze on Jordan, his heart pounding as he waited for the right moment. When the event ended, attendees gathered around Jordan, shaking his hand and taking photos. Mark waited until the crowd thinned before stepping forward. Jordan noticed him immediately, his expression unreadable. "Officer Taylor," Jordan said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Mark removed his hat, holding it in his hands like a shield. "I came to apologize," he said, "for what happened yesterday." The room fell quiet as a few people nearby turned to watch. Jordan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Apologies are a start," he said, echoing the words he had spoken the day before. "But they're not enough. So why are you really here?" Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, "about assumptions, about respect. And you're right. I was wrong. I let my bias cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. I'm not proud of what I did, but I want to make it right." Jordan studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "And how do you plan to do that?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Mark said honestly, "but I'm here to learn. I want to understand how I can do better, not just for you, but for everyone I serve." The sincerity in Mark's voice seemed to resonate with Jordan. He gestured for Mark to follow him to a quieter corner of the room. "Change doesn't happen overnight, officer," Jordan said. "It takes effort, reflection, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about yourself and the system you're part of." "I'm ready to do that," Mark replied. "I've already started. I've been reading about your work, about what you've been through, and I see now that this isn't just about me making a mistake. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again, to anyone." Jordan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "If you're serious about this, there's something you can do," he said. "Come to one of the workshops we host for law enforcement and community members. It's designed to bridge the gap between officers and the people they serve. It's not easy, but it's a step in the right direction. Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be there," he said. "Thank you for giving me the chance." Jordan extended a hand, and Mark shook it firmly. The gesture was simple, but carried significant weight, a step toward accountability and understanding. As Mark left the community center, he felt a sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to prove that he could change. And for Jordan, the moment was a reminder that standing up against prejudice could lead to progress, even if the steps were small. The crowd outside watched as Mark walked to his car, some murmuring quietly. Jordan joined them, addressing the group with calm confidence. "This isn't about one person," he said. "It's about all of us. Change takes time, but it starts with moments like these." The tension eased, replaced with a sense of cautious hope. For both men, the confrontation had revealed not just the flaws in the system, but the possibilities for growth. And though the journey was far from over, the seeds of change had been planted. In the weeks following the incident, both Officer Mark Taylor and Jordan Mitchell found their lives profoundly impacted. The parking lot confrontation had sparked widespread conversations within the community, amplified by the videos shared online. What began as a moment of prejudice had evolved into an opportunity for change. For Mark, the fallout was immediate and humbling. He was placed under review by his precinct, required to attend mandatory bias training, and was temporarily reassigned to desk duty. These consequences weighed heavily on him, but he knew they were justified. The guilt of his actions lingered, and he wrestled with the realization of how his assumptions had hurt not only Jordan, but the trust people placed in law enforcement. Mark approached the bias training with skepticism at first, unsure if it would truly make a difference. But, as the sessions progressed, he found himself listening to stories that mirrored his own mistakes. A young man shared how he was repeatedly stopped and questioned in his own neighborhood. A mother described the fear she felt every time her son left the house, worried he'd be judged by the color of his skin rather than his character. Each story chipped away at the defensive walls Mark had built over the years. He began to see how his actions were part of a larger system of bias and inequality, and it shook him to his core. Meanwhile, Jordan continued his work as a community leader. The incident had brought him even more recognition, but he remained focused on the bigger picture. He knew his experience wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that affected countless others. Determined to turn the moment into a movement, Jordan expanded his mentorship programs and began collaborating with local law enforcement to create workshops aimed at fostering understanding and accountability. One of these workshops brought Mark and Jordan together again. It was held in a large community center, with officers, community leaders, and residents sitting side by side in small groups. The goal was to break down barriers through honest conversations, and for Mark, it was both challenging and eye-opening. When it was his turn to speak, Mark stood up, feeling the weight of the room's attention. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he began, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "What I did that day in the parking lot was wrong. I made assumptions about Jordan because of my own biases, and I let those assumptions dictate my actions. That's not what being a police officer should be about." The room was silent, but the intensity of the moment was palpable. Mark continued. "This experience has forced me to confront things I didn't want to see about myself and the system I'm part of. I've realized that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about treating everyone with respect and dignity, no matter what." Jordan listened carefully, nodding as Mark spoke. When it was his turn to address the group, Jordan stood and looked directly at Mark. "I appreciate your words, Officer Taylor," he said. "But as I've said before, apologies are just the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Jordan paused, scanning the room. "This isn't just about one officer making a mistake," he said. "It's about a system that allows those mistakes to happen over and over again. It's about the people in this room, officers, community members, leaders, working together to make sure these moments lead to real change." The workshop continued with discussions that were at times uncomfortable, but always honest. Stories were shared, misconceptions were challenged, and connections were formed. By the end of the day, both Mark and Jordan felt a sense of cautious hope. It wouldn't be easy, but the seeds of progress had been planted. Mark's journey didn't end there. Over the following months, he became an advocate for change within his precinct. He pushed for more comprehensive training, supported initiatives that encouraged officers to engage with the community, and openly shared his own experience as a cautionary tale. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to ensure it didn't happen again. For Jordan, the impact of the incident continued to ripple outward. His story became a rallying cry for justice, inspiring others to speak out against prejudice and advocate for fairness. But Jordan always emphasized the importance of action over words. "Change doesn't happen because we talk about it," he often said. "It happens because we do the work." One day, months after the workshop, Mark and Jordan found themselves at another community event. This time, they stood together on stage, addressing a packed audience. Mark spoke first, his voice steady and sincere. "I'm here today because I made a mistake," he said, "and because someone had the courage to hold me accountable. Jordan didn't just call me out, he gave me the chance to learn and grow. For that, I'll always be grateful." The crowd applauded as Mark stepped back, and Jordan took the microphone. "This isn't about forgiveness," Jordan said, his tone firm but hopeful. "It's about accountability. It's about understanding that every decision we make, every action we take, has the power to hurt or to heal. It's up to us to choose which path we walk." The applause was thunderous, a reflection of the hope and determination shared by everyone in the room. As the event concluded, people lined up to thank both Mark and Jordan, sharing their own stories and expressing their support. Walking out of the venue, Mark turned to Jordan. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for holding me accountable, but for giving me the chance to be better." Jordan smiled. "Accountability isn't just about punishment," he replied. "It's about growth, and we all have the capacity to grow if we're willing to put in the work." The two men shook hands, a gesture that symbolized not just reconciliation, but a shared commitment to creating a better future. For Mark, it was the beginning of a new chapter, as a better officer and a better person. For Jordan, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right could inspire real change. The incident that had started with a mistaken assumption had transformed into a powerful lesson for Mark, for Jordan, and for everyone who had witnessed it. And while the road to justice and equality remained long, moments like these were steps in the right direction. Together, they showed that change, while difficult, was always possible. This story isn't just about one officer's mistake or one man's resilience. It's a lesson for all of us. Officer Mark Taylor learned the hard way that assumptions and biases can lead to actions that hurt not only individuals, but entire communities. Jordan Mitchell showed incredible composure, turning an unfair situation into an opportunity for change. Together, their experience became a powerful example of the need for accountability, growth, and understanding. But the question remains, how do we move forward? How can we ensure that moments like this lead to real change? It starts with each of us, challenging our own biases, standing up against injustice, and working to create a world where respect and equality are the norm, not the exception. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think people like Mark deserve a second chance if they're willing to change? How can we, as individuals, contribute to creating a fairer society? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and share it to keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. These are the narratives that spark meaningful conversations and remind us of our shared humanity. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next story, a tale that could change the way you see the world. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time. Stay inspired, stay hopeful, and stay committed to justice. See you next time.